Well, this is Dr. Stan here at Radio Liberty, coming to you from the hills overlooking beautiful and picturesque Monterey Bay and bringing you the news behind the news, the story behind the story, hoping to convince you that reality is usually scoffed at and that illusion is usually king. But in the battle for survival of Western civilization, it's going to be reality and not illusion or delusion that's going to determine what the future will bring. And I need to remind you the views expressed here are not necessarily those of the owners, management, staff, sponsors, or supporters of the station you're listening to. They're my views. And for the next hour, they're going to be the views of Ambassador Henry Cooper. And Ambassador Cooper was the United States representative in the negotiations with the Soviet Union a number of years ago, having to do with certainly limiting the amount of weapons of various sorts. Ambassador Cooper, thank you very much for being with us.
It's great to be with you again, Dr. Stan.
Well, basically, of course, the reason we've asked Ambassador Cooper to come with us today is because sometime in the last couple of weeks there was a meeting held on an EMP, or electromagnetic pulse attack. And certainly all of the experts on this were there. James Woolsey, former director of the CIA, was there. A man who'd written a book called 1 Second After, and basically talks about what would happen if there really were an EMP attack. Ambassador Cooper was there as a speaker, and who else were some of the people who attended that meeting?
Fritz Ehrmoth, who chaired the National Intelligence Council during the Reagan years. I think he was chairman then, if not later. He was very active in the intelligence community for many years. Many believe one of the best of the intelligence officers. Try to think for a minute. Bill Fortune, who wrote the book 1 Second After, took part in the conversation. You mentioned Jim Woolsey, former CIA director. Peter Pry, who is the director of an activity called the Task Force for National and Homeland Security, I believe is the title of it. And we can talk more about that when we go along, because he was the executive director of the congressionally appointed Commission on Electromagnetic Pulse, the threat of electromagnetic pulse.
Well, anyway, there are a lot of experts there. And
right. Bill Graham was, Ronald Reagan's science advisor and chairman of that group, and Roscoe Bartlett, congressman from Maryland, has been a prime mover in these areas up on the Hill. If I could just finish one thought, Stan. It's amazing to me that it took years to get this commission underway, had some pretty important conclusions as late as 2006, and nothing, I repeat, nothing has been done to protect the American people from this extraordinary threat.
And this is an extraordinary threat. And could you explain to our listeners what the threat is, what the EMP attack is, what is the threat, and what could happen if there was an EMP attack on America? Well,
the simplest threat in the near term that I can imagine is that if Iran gets a nuclear weapon, and they wed it to even a 70-year-old technology called the Scud missile, put it on a ship and launch it off of our coast, detonate the nuclear weapon at somewhere between 60 and 100 miles above the United States, it could, in fact, cause damage to our electric power, our transportation systems, our communication systems, all the things that we depend on for just-in-time marketing and such activities in the United States. In our discussions, Fritz Ehrmoth commented that it was his belief that this could put us back to the Stone Age, at least to the 18th century.
And because what we're really talking about is the loss of electricity, loss of our electronic grids. Certainly, our whole society is based upon the availability of electricity and of power. And suddenly, literally 1 second after, while large segments of the United States would be devoid of electricity, and as we would be saying, we're almost back to the Stone Age. Well, this is Dr. Stan here at Radio Liberty. Our guest this afternoon is Ambassador Henry Cooper, and formerly was our ambassador to the negotiations with the Soviets having to do with disarmament. But more recently, he participated in a conference that was held where there were the leading experts on electromagnetic pulse attacks. And they were together. It's certainly EMP. They call it an EMP attack. And they were simply talking about, is there a real danger of an EMP attack? And the decision reached by people, many of them having held high positions in government in the past and some of them holding high positions in government today, agreed that there is a very real threat of an electromagnetic pulse attack, which could basically send America back to the Stone Age. Ambassador, please go right ahead with your discussion.
Well, the point I was making, and you're correct, it would destroy the electric power, and that's the one area that we might be able to do something about in the near term that would allow us to bring the power grid back up. And it would cost, I don't know, a few $100 million to accomplish that, which is a lot of money, of course, to those of us who are outside, but not a great deal of money to when you consider the federal budget. And since the first job of the government is supposed to provide from the common defense, you would think they would do this, and they haven't done anything about this well-understood threat, in spite of the fact a few friends on the Hill, congressmen, have tried. And it's really important to understand what the implications are. It's complicated physics, not new physics. It was well known during the Cold War and during one of my jobs. I oversaw all of the Air Force's strategic and space systems, and we worried about this effect on our strategic systems and did everything we could to try to harden strategic aircraft, missiles, and communication systems so the president could communicate with our forces. But nothing was done to assure the survival of our key critical infrastructures, and it's not just the power. Your automobile, if it's newer than 1968 or so, has electronics as integral part, and it's quite possible that those electronics could be damaged and you would be shut down and unable to drive. So you wouldn't be able to get more than the horse and buggy could take you from your home or your own leg.
Hold that thought, please. Hold that thought.
Okay.
Well, this is Dr. Stan, and certainly Ambassador Cooper is simply saying that with an EMP attack, it could simply wipe out the electronics and, for all intents and purposes, take us back to almost the Stone Age. Basically, most of the cars would not run because they have highly technical electronic equipment that would actually be wiped out by an EMP attack. And certainly our grids, our electronic grids, could be protected by the expenditure of a few $100 million. But this has not been done, even though this threat has been widely recognized in Washington, D.C. And the question is, why? Why haven't they done what is logical? Because a second-rate or third-rate country like Iran could attack America and simply destroy our infrastructure. This is not an imaginary threat. It's a very real threat. And what's going on, Ambassador, as with so many other things, just doesn't make sense. But you go right ahead. Okay.
Well, it's not well known, perhaps because during the Cold War, when we worried a great deal about this, and because we discovered it in the nuclear test, the high-altitude nuclear test in the early 1960s, an event called Starfish, and it was in the South Pacific, and it damaged the electrical outlets and power in Hawaii, turning off street lights and that sort of thing. Of course, that was very early electronics, and old-fashioned electronics. It was the era of vacuum tubes and so on, not transistors. People today wouldn't even know what a vacuum tube is, probably. But they were inherently harder than current electronics. But during the Cold War, once it became known, and we were surprised by this, and by the way, the Russians learned a great deal about it, in their series that was conducted in the early 60s. What we did was in reaction to the Russians. We had undertaken a test ban ourselves, and we had not well planned to deal with this issue. So after the Cold War was over, we learned a great deal from the Russians about the phenomena that took us beyond what our experimental knowledge was in any case. And it turns out that the Russians and practically every country in the world knows about this effect, at least at the government level. Iran certainly does. They have tested in ways that we think could be to illustrate their knowledge of the effect and willingness to detonate a nuclear warhead at altitude. The only reason to imagine that they would do that is for this effect. It would not cause damage on the ground due to the blast. It's too high up. But it would be catastrophic to the electronics, as I've said.
And didn't you comment that Iran had actually been going out of the Caspian Sea and putting missiles up 100 miles or so and then detonating them, which is exactly what you do if you were going to launch certainly an EMP attack on America?
Right. If they had a nuclear weapon, it is the kind of thing you'd do. What we've seen is them execute some sort of a triggering action at high altitude, and then it's been described as a test failure. But if you understand what I'm talking about, it's nothing more than a demonstration of what you would do if it was intended to be an EMP attack. In other words, they basically have shown such a system would work. And yes, they've been launched out in the Caspian Sea. Iran doesn't have a nuclear weapon, at least we don't think they do. So this is part of what is at issue in our argument to prevent them from ever gaining such a capability. Israel, I believe, is truly serious about stopping them. I'm not sure we are.
All right, fine. Well, basically, of course, the people who attended this conference are all experts on an EMP attack. Is there anybody else besides Iran who might launch such an attack on the United States?
Yes, as I indicated, many people understand what could happen, and it needn't be even a state, international state. It could be a bunch of terrorists if somehow they got their hands on a nuclear weapon. The other thing of note is that we could defend against this if we have the defenses locally. As I said, these are relatively short-range missiles if they're launched from off our coast, and we have today some 24 Aegis ships deployed around the world that have the capability of shooting them down if we're near enough to our coast to do so. We operate on the east and west coast all the time with some ships in transit. So we have some defense against this capability for those, particularly along the eastern seaboard and the west coast, but we have nothing for those who live around the Gulf of Mexico, and because our Aegis ships don't really travel there. And that's one of the reasons we at High Frontier are advocates for building what's referred to as Aegis ashore at military bases around the Gulf of Mexico to protect against this kind of a threat. And by the way, Iran is cooperating with Venezuela on the technologies that are associated with ballistic missiles. No reason to believe they won't with respect to nuclear technologies as well. And so we may be looking at the potential for a repeat of the Cuban Missile Crisis now from Venezuela, from the south, and again, we're defenseless against this.
Well, of course, if there was to be an EMP attack on America, it would be very inexpensive for the people who are launching this. Certainly there'd be tremendous retaliation against them if we knew who had done it. But we wouldn't even necessarily know who had done it. But what would happen to the American people if this should actually take place?
Well, as we said earlier, the first thing that would happen is you would find you're immobile. And anyone who's been through a major storm of the sort that we had in the East Coast a few weeks ago, or many other places in the country, or Katrina, or whatever, you know what happens when we have shut down on the transport of key goods. The grocery store shelves are gone empty, within hours. If not hours, then a day or so, and there is no food. Medicine supplies, critical supplies of that sort will give out. These are the kinds of things that are described in the 1 Second After book, which I would recommend your listeners to read to understand what the impact would be. And the Stone Age aspects of this that we've referred to is the expectation that up to, the range of estimates that have been testified to the Congress by some of the experts is between 2/3 and 90% of the American people would perish within 18 months after such an attack.
2/3 to 90% of the American people would perish within
18 months. Mm-hmm.
Of the attack. I mean, these are frightening figures, and yet these are not really being put out by alarmists. These are putting out by people who are trying to sound the alarm and to get the people to understand this is a very real threat. And for some reason or other, the people in Washington, D.C. just don't want to address it.
Well, let me tell you one more thing we haven't talked about yet, but it's very important, and it's one that we can't really impact as we can perhaps the Iranian threat, and that is our sun. Every so often, and we know that the sun lets off electromagnetic impulses of one form or another. What most people don't realize is that there is a really large category of such events that happens on the order of a century or so. And the last time a major event, which is referred to as a Carrington event, happened was in 1859, which created havoc to the telegraphy at the time, but it had no impact on the people to speak of because we were an agrarian society. Everyone grew their own food. The local stores took care of what was necessary. We traveled by horse and buggy. We might have used the train, I suppose, in 1859, but there weren't even many trains, as I recall. And so while it was a major event, and it is documented, it caused what we refer to as the Northern Lights all the way into the Caribbean, as I recall it, and as I said, did damage telegraphy. If that were to happen today, it would create the same problems that we've referred to as the Iranian nuclear weapon, and we have no way of controlling that. God, after all, is a little more powerful and indifferent to our feeble ways than the Iranians. So,
now, is this what you call a solar storm? Is it related to a solar storm, or how does it differ from a solar storm?
It is. It's just much greater magnitude. If you see the pictures every now and then of what you're referring to as the solar storm. We are, in fact, going right now for the next 18 months through what is referred to as a solar maxima. If you read the National Geographic magazine, the June issue had a special feature on just exactly what we're talking about and the fact that we are in a maxima. The last time there was a significant set of events was in 1921. It was not nearly so large as the Carrington event, but it caused a great deal of damage. But again, in 1921, we were still an agrarian society, and we were individually sufficient in many ways. Cities and villages took care of themselves. That's not the case anymore.
And I think this is what people have to understand, is that basically we're so dependent upon everything in society. And suddenly there's not a lot of food in our food stores. Suddenly most people are incapable of growing food for themselves. We're used to simply, if we want something, we go down to the store and buy it. But if this were to happen, why, there'd be no transportation, there'd be no food in the stores, there'd be no drugs in the pharmacies, there'd be no products there in the hardware stores, and we'd see the whole society as we and know it today simply cease to exist. It could happen with an EMP attack, it could happen with a solar storm. We're not talking about something imaginary, we're talking about a very important conference held within the last couple of weeks and how little we've read about it in the paper. Ambassador, you go right ahead with your discussion, please.
Well, I'd be pleased to address any particular aspect of this you'd like to talk about in detail. I am hopeful that we'll have, the recording of the teleconference, the webinar, we refer to it, because none of us were actually in the same place. We had people all over the country taking part in this. Bill Graham, who was, as I indicated, Ronald Reagan's science advisor, and I were lieutenants together in the 1960s down at the Air Force Weapons Laboratory, where we were studying these effects together, and Bill is one of the first to be engaged in understanding the phenomena. He actually invented some of the methodologies and so on that we use to harden our equipment and so on against our strategic forces. And we have served together over the years in one fashion or another, including in the Reagan years when I was Reagan's chief negotiator and he was Reagan's science advisor. He is very knowledgeable on these subjects. He's worked it from the bottom up, from the advent of our discovery of the effect and its influence on all of our systems, both civil and military. And he chaired this commission that I was talking about, testified to Congress. He managed to prevail on the bureaucracy to eventually get major portions of the report declassified, and I can get those materials to you, Dr. Sand, so that you can put it on your webpage if you would like, and make it available to as many people as we can get to.
Yes, I really would like very much to have that so we can post that. Now, basically, of course, will certainly, for instance, would cars be damaged even if they're turned off? In other words, they're not running. What about certainly generators and other electronic gadgets for generating electricity? If they're not running, would they be damaged?
They very well could be. You familiar with what a SCADA is?
I'm really not.
It's the thing that's in your thermostat, probably in your home. It's the electronics that basically switches circuits in one form or another. They are susceptible to the EMP, and they can be damaged whether the circuits are live or not. And that's the case with your car. Your ignition is electronics. And much of the infrastructure that we have depends in a critical way on this. GPS, the Global Positioning Satellite System, is not really hard to this effect, so we would likely lose the satellites. That means you lose your ability to navigate unless you're still carrying a compass and are familiar with navigation by the stars and other things, which even our military don't learn anymore. It would be a pervasive and a major problem. Can't overstate the problem.
Well, now, what about the individual? Would this have an impact on the individual? Certainly, we have a lot of electronic circuits within our own body. Our heart certainly operates electronically. Our minds operate electronically. What does this do to human beings?
The insidious nature of this threat is that it would cause no particular physical damage on the surface of the Earth if it were a high-altitude nuclear explosion.
Hold that thought. We'll be right back. Well, this is Dr. Stan, and Ambassador Smith is simply talking about the devastating effects that this sort of a blast in space, EMP attack would have, certainly on society. And basically, of course, it would have very little impact, certainly on human beings. Would that be a fair statement, or how would it impact on the individual?
I would have very little impact. And the hardening that we're talking about, so you understand, it's sort of like everybody's familiar with lightning. Lightning is sort of like an electromagnetic effect of sorts, but it's not of the major power, if you will, of the kind of attack we're talking about. And surge arresters are common, and that's sort of what needs to be. A glorified surge arrestor is what needs to be included in the transformers of our power grid. And there are, I forget how many now, but not a large number of transformers in the grid around the country. We don't build them in this country. They're built in Germany and other places. It's like a lot of other things we don't produce anymore. So we don't have access to replacing what's there. And if we had the equivalent of a surge arrestor, which is the kind of thing you do to protect your computer against lightning and that kind of an effect, we have that sort of thing. We have something that could shield around critical equipment and so on. That would be helpful. There are activities that those who are familiar and work in the civil defense field could do to be helpful beyond storing food and critical equipment and so on. We're looking to buy an old-fashioned trash can, garbage can that's metal, and make sure it's sealed tightly, producing, in effect, a Faraday cage, so-called, which is one of the ways, and put inside of it some key electronics like shortwave radio and that sort of thing, other things you might use at home, and as a way of hardening in a de facto way. There's no reason this can't work so long as you're careful and really have an airtight seal, a metal sheath around what you're trying to protect. Shielding is really no more complicated as an idea than that. And by the same token, unless you have a complete shield, it turns out that the electromagnetic effects will seek their way into really small cracks. And so it's something that has to be fairly carefully done. So there are things that can be done if we educate ourselves and take precautions, appropriate precautions. And I mentioned storing food in passing. I don't know about you, but Bobby, my wife, and I are storing up food. I mean, this is a problem that could happen. We spend time in South Carolina as well as Virginia. We have most of it on the farm down there because I want to be where I can, if I have to go back to gardening the old-fashioned way, we can do it. It's a little harder near Washington, D.C.
Yes, it is, because you get a little harder as you get a little older, too. You're not to that point, but I am, although we still have our vegetable garden and we're just learning so much about this. Well, basically, of course, that this is such an important issue. I've known about this for really many years, but you tend to forget about it because nobody talks about it. And certainly what I'm hoping is that what happened in this meeting, this webinar that you had, the information will be made available on the internet. Do you think it would be able to get this up there in such a pattern that people will be able to watch this and realize that this is not imaginary? This is a very real threat, probably much more of a threat than most of the things we're concerned about?
I believe, I'm hoping that it will be up by the end of the week on the web, and I will make sure you get it, Dr. Stan. Make sure you understand this is not lots of pictures, although there is a video, and I can send you that video now to look at, which is pretty descriptive, and you can put that on your web page now. But the webinar is audio, just like we're talking now, and I think pretty explicit on the concerns by some folks who really know what they're talking about.
Well, our telephone number is 1-888-24-LIBERTY. 1-888-24-LIBERTY or 464-8295 if you're out there in the listening audience and you have a question for Ambassador Cooper. I think this is a very, very important issue. I think it's something we should be talking about a lot more. And yet, of course, since they don't focus our attention on it, we're not aware. But certainly this is something that could have a dramatic effect on the very survival of our nation as a first world nation. And basically, of course, it was said at this webinar by people who are very knowledgeable that if there should come an attack of this sort, America would return to the Stone Age. And certainly between 60 and 90% of our population would be dead in a year and a half.
Let us swear allegiance
Well, this is Dr. Stan, and Ambassador, would you mind taking some calls from our listeners out there across America?
I'd be pleased to do so.
Well, let's then go to Rich, who's calling from Aromas. Rich, do you have a question for the Ambassador?
Hi, Grandpa Liberty. Hi, Mr. Ambassador. It's so good to talk to you. On Monday here at our local station in Monterey, they had a fellow named Scott, and he was saying that to protect the freezers that you piggy bank those strips, those power strips. So you put one in the wall, and then you plug the other strip into the first strip, and then you plug your refrigerator in. And he's saying that would protect the freezer or the refrigerator if the grid goes out.
Well, but this has nothing to do with the grid going out. Well, Ambassador Cooper, do you have any thoughts on that? Basically, Rich is suggesting you put a couple of these
power strips,
circuit breakers, power strips in the circuit. Would this help or not?
Well, that was what I was referring to. Is we know what a surge arrestor is to protect against the short pulse, of a lightning strike. And that sort of thing, nearby lightning strike. This is much more, potentially damaging than a nearby lightning strike. I don't think that would do you any good if you got a direct strike of lightning either. The other thing to note is that if the power grid goes down, you don't get any electricity to anything.
Well, I have a generator here at the ranch, and that was my second question, Ambassador. I have an aluminum roof on my garage, and then I have a shed inside the garage, and I have my Honda generator. If that is not working at the time, if I put aluminum foil around it, would that protect it, or do I have to get a big garbage can and maybe weld a couple of them together?
Well, it might, something equivalent to the latter is probably a smarter thing to do. I'm not an electrical engineer. My training is mechanical engineering, and I know what the effects are and the general prevention techniques are, but that's a good question, and let me try to get an answer and get that back to Dr. Stan.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know that just putting foil around it will do good.
Hold that thought. Well, this is Dr. Stan. We've had certainly Rich calling from Aromas. Rich, we'll get the information and get back to you. Thanks very much. And we have, of course, a board full of people who are actually calling in. But if you're certainly, before we do that, Ambassador, do you have a website, or where could people go to get more information on the EMP attack, or certainly one of these solar catastrophes we were talking about?
I should have had that handy. Rather than the High Frontier area, because we're a missile defense guy. Let me, while we're talking, I'll see if I can't get on the computer and give you the website for this task force for national and homeland security. And I believe they have a website that's up. It's not going, if it's not, there will be one shortly. And that's where I would recommend you go.
All right, fine. Well, let's go to Dean, who's calling us from Spokane, Washington. Dean, do you have a question?
I've got a couple of questions, if I may, sir. One is, I'm on a well, and so I have an electric pump, right? So say the grid goes down, and is there some way to run my electric pump mechanically? In other words, if I had like a 5-horse Briggs engine, could I tap that into the plumbing that goes down into the water?
Basically, you would have to have electricity for it, and we may not have any electricity.
Yeah,
I'm not asking can I run the electric
right? I hear you.
That pump.
When I was a boy on the farm, which is where I grew up, we had a number of wells on our place with hand pumps. And we're thinking about installing one just so that we can have water. And you're quite correct. Water is more important than food, as I'm sure you know. Without resource to water, you won't last as long as you can go, without food. And spring water is good. If you're near running water of any sort, having the chemicals to purify the water is a good idea. If that's the gist of what you're trying to get at. But a well
What I'm
with a
trying to
hand
get
pump
at
is
is
the
this.
most
Okay.
straightforward way to do it.
Okay, Dean, I'm going to put you on hold and put you back to Barbara. She'll have some information for you, and we will have information on hand pumps here very, very soon. A very effective hand pump if you have access to a well, okay? Hang on here, and let's give you back, and let's go to Larry, Pastor Frank, who's calling us from West Virginia. How, Pastor Frank, do you have a question or comment?
Hello, yes I do. Two-part question. One was partly answered by you with the previous caller about his garage. I was thinking in terms of maybe a aluminized roof coating, like painted onto the inside of a garage or exterior of the garage to protect it, acting as a type of Faraday cage. But also, I was going to ask you, Ambassador, would it be a good idea for us Americans, since it's such a high-risk, critical time which you're facing, is to learn to live like the Amish?
Learn a little what?
To learn to live like the Amish.
people.
In other words, the Amish live without electricity. They live very
that's
simple
right.
lives, but of course, they primary means of transportation is the
Right.
horse and buggy. And basically, of course, if this were to happen, it would have very little impact on the Amish.
Yes, you're correct, and it would have had very little impact on the world I grew up in on the farm in South Carolina when I was a boy. I've already said, hand wells were, we had several on our farm. We also had a well that pumped water up from below the surface, and we have lots of springs there. And we grew our own food, and well, I had horses and mules and whatever, and it was not unusual to use them for transportation. It's just that world is gone. It's not there anymore. None of those wells are operating on our farm now. So one of my neighbors had, this really innovative thing. Their well was operated by a windmill, which worked fine when the wind was blowing, but not very well otherwise. But it allowed them to store water in a tank well above the surface, so that they use gravity drive to then run the water into their home. So I mean, there's a lost generation of dealing with the common elements of life that somehow we've lost. I mean, we just don't do it anymore. And we're stuck with the consequences.
Okay, anything else, Pastor Frank?
No, I think that answers it very well. Thank you so much, sir.
Let me say one more thing. I'm skeptical of painting on a shield, and it may be that it is conducting, but I will. It's purely anecdotal and it's well out of date. Otherwise, I wouldn't tell you. In the very early days, when in the '60s, when we first became aware of this problem, and we were worried about hardening our strategic forces to them, we found that even though we knew what to do in the silos where we keep our ballistic missiles in North Dakota and other places at that time, it was important to have a shield, and we had between the lid on the silo and the rest of it, there were contacts, metal contacts. One of the problems we ran into was that the people in their housekeeping wanted to paint over those because it'd make it look pretty. Well, it might look pretty, but it broke the shield. So it's really very difficult to maintain a shield, and I think you have to work at it to make it so.
Okay, fine. Well, thank you, Pastor Frank. And let's go to Larry, who's calling from Louisiana. Once again, our telephone number is 1-888-24-LIBERTY, 1-888-24-LIBERTY, or 464-8295. And Larry from Louisiana, do you have a question for the ambassador?
Yes. Okay, so you knew about this kind of thing in the 60s. Why has this been perpetrated on the public at large? I can conceive a mechanical carburetor, a mechanical fuel pump, a magneto that's not chipped, set of plug wires and a set of spark plugs, and that engine's going to keep running. Okay. I can also conceive the diesel engine without electronic...
Bob, Bob. Basically, it is just the fact that most of the people do not have these non-electronic situations. Do you have a question, certainly?
Why were they taken away? Why were we on nuclear hard?
All right, fine. Basically, why didn't we do anything if we've known about this since the 1960s?
He's correct. I mean, this wouldn't have been a problem for Model A Ford. I had one of those on the farm, too, when I grew up. In fact, you used to laugh and joke that you could keep that Model A running with baling wire. I don't think anybody uses baling wire anymore either. So, I mean, it's just that time moves on. We don't, that isn't the way most of our systems operate anymore. I mentioned earlier, if you have an automobile that's older, I don't remember exactly which year it was we began to install the electronics, but sometime in the 1960s we began to put in electronic ignition, remove the points and plugs, and that normally we ran with in times past. And so the engine, I can't even service my own car anymore. Yet when I grew up, I did that all the time. So it's just that we're incompetent with the materials that advanced technology has provided today. The average guy in the street is. And furthermore, the damage that will be created by the electromagnetic pulse will make it such that even an expert can't put it back together again. Humpty Dumpty fell off the wall, and that's unfortunately the nature of this threat.
Okay, fine. So I telephone again, 1-888-24-LIBERTY, 1-888-24-LIBERTY, or 464-8295 here in the Central Coast of California. And we've got Kevin calling from Ohio. Hi, Kevin. Do you have a question for our guest?
Yes. Hi, Dr. Stan and Ambassador. Thank you very much for this information. God bless you both. Dr. Stan, one thing I want to make one small quick comment, but I have an important question I want to ask the ambassador. One is, everybody keeps alluding to the Amish being so self-sustaining. I live in the heart of the old order Amish, and they depend so much on vehicular traveling. They buy all their goods out of stores. They wear eyeglasses. They have diesel motors on all their farms to put up the materials into barns. They are really as dependent as we are. It's a myth.
Okay, fine. Well, I appreciate you bringing that out. Now, did you have a question for our guest?
Yes, I do. On the size of the EMP, the locality, the region that one small one could affect, and then secondly, aren't we going to be at the mercy if this country is affected, but not another country like an invading country, when they still have the technologies, the electrical components and things to keep going? Won't we be at the mercy of invasions that will not, just overdo everything we could do to prevent, or stay alive?
Yeah, well, the regrettable thing about this is it's a great leveling influence. This becomes the weapon of choice for, it's called an asymmetric threat. We consider ourselves, and justifiably so, as the most powerful nation on the surface of the earth. But if you happen to be a relatively weak nation compared to us, i.e. Iran, and you want to level the playing field, this is just the greatest kind of weapon to do it, because it takes us down to their level and lower. We are dependent, just the average guy in the street today, in so many ways on the global positioning satellite system, the GPS system, for timing information of all sorts, for transportation support, for our military systems. It's just amazing all that we have become dependent on, because it's very efficient to do it that way. Most of our food in this country is no longer produced in this country. We import it. And even that is produced in the bread belt or whatever has to be transported to the rest of the country. And if that transportation system breaks down, we're unprepared in our cities and regrettably in many of our more rural areas as well. So yes, you're right. We're ripe for invasion, but I'm not sure why they would want to invade immediately. As I said earlier, if it's a country that is weak compared to us in the way we measure power today, why not just wait for 18 months when we're taken down to size?
What about another country? One affects the EMP. Secondly, then it opens up to the other vultures that are sitting on the fence rails.
That's correct. And as I said earlier, the Soviet Union well understood these effects, probably better than we. And in fact, one of the comments that Congressman Bartlett made, he referred to conversations that he and Congressman Weldon had, back in the 90s with a number of Russians. And one of the Russians there said to him, that if we really wanted to take you down to size, this is what we do. We would attack you with a few weapons above the United States, wouldn't cause any damage on the ground, and you'd be just turned off. We'd turn off your system, and you'd be brought back, to the last century in the way you live. This is my characterization of what he said, shorthand. And
Kevin, I think that there is a very real problem, and this is one reason we're having the program today. Anything else you want to say before we let you go?
Well, I'd say God bless you, Dr. Stan. I hope you could stay on shortwave.
Okay, God bless. Well, let's go to Dean, who's the Dean we had with us before, and asking about certainly some sort of pumps. Go ahead, Dean. Do you have a question or comment?
I have a second question, if I may.
Sure,
I'm asking about 12-volt batteries, because a lot of the stuff is able to be powered by 12 volts, but if there's an electrical charge, how would a 12-volt battery handle it? Or if you have a 12-volt battery, you can get one dry and then have a box of electrolyte just in case of emergency. So
all right, fine. Now, basically, your question is,
what would a box of electrolyte do if it was if it had a charge automatically just shot through it like that? Would it explode or something? Would the plates on the dry battery fuse themselves together? Is this a safe way to go?
All right, fine. Let's ask a question. What about, do we have any thoughts at all or any knowledge really what would happen to our 12-volt batteries? Would they be any means of storing electricity, or would they be affected by this electromagnetic pulse attack?
I need to get you in contact with an electrical type that really understands these effects to answer that question directly. My instinct would be that what you're describing is precisely the kind of thing I'd want to put in a garbage can. Okay, fine. And Dean, thank you very much. And we'll try to get the information. We're going to try to get some other people on who can deal with these various questions we have. And let's go to Tom, who's calling from California. Hi, Tom. How are you doing? You have a question or comment?
Yes. Hi, Dr. Stan. I have an off-grid solar-powered home, and I'm wondering how the solar panel and electronics would hold up in an EMP burst. I've talked to numerous people about it and got it in widely conflicting answers.
All right, fine. Then the question is, how would solar electricity hold up? And certainly, to have solar electricity, you have to have an inverter to convert the solar electricity into something that's useful with either 12 or 48 or 110 volt. Do you have any thoughts on that, Mr. Ambassador?
No, I'm afraid I'm not an expert in that field. I've been thinking the same sort of thing, and because solar power, of course, it's always with you. You don't get lots of power that way, but it's worth trying to figure out how to preserve the option to assure you can get it, that the panels will work, and that you have the connections between that and equipment that you want to power, and assure that equipment survives.
Tom, I think we're just going to have to learn about these things, and we'll try to get some experts on here who can really tell us. I mean, my fear is that if you are certainly very close to this EMP attack, that your inverter would go out. But we'll have to just wait and see. And it may be, of course, that this would be depend upon the area as well. But we'll just have to wait and see, okay?
very good. You're right. We will just have to find out. Let's hope we don't find out the hard way.
Okay, let's hope we don't find. I agree with you totally. Well, let's go to Jack calling from Atlanta, Georgia. Hi, Jack. Have a question or comment?
Yes. How effective is earth ground of the chassis of the automobile? How would it affect the electronics in the automobile itself?
If you have electronic ignition, it is my understanding that you can expect to lose the, that you will, it won't work. It will actually damage the ignition system.
You don't think earth grounding would help?
From what I understood from others, I don't think so.
Okay, Jack, we're just going to have to wait and find out, and we're going to try to get some more experts on here.
You need an electrical expert to answer this.
Okay, thanks very much, and we'll be back in just a moment. Well, it's been a fascinating program. We've got about 3 minutes to wrap up the program, and then we'll let you go. But what would you like to say in parting thoughts for our listeners out across America?
Well, I think that need to connect you with some people who really understand, what to do on the civil defense side. If Bill Graham would agree to spend some time talking with you, he knows the answers to all the questions that we were just discussing. He really has been party to this all the way along, and I'll try to put you in contact with him. Bill is okay.
All right, well, fine. We'll appreciate that. And, of course, we would like very much to talk to the gentleman who wrote that book 1 second after, because, of course, that is...
I can give you contact information for all those folks.
All right, well...
Peter Pry, the executive director for the Task Force on National and Homeland Security, is also someone that I'm sure would be happy to talk.
Well, we'll certainly contact you away from the program, but I will tell you that we got a remarkable response as soon as we opened up the lines, Chris, as you can tell. We have listeners all across America, and certainly the first hour we had hardly any calls. The second hour we had a hard time even managing all the calls that came in. So I think there's an awareness that there's a real problem out there. It's just how are we going to get people to understand? I really do hope if there is a video, you could get that to me. We'll make sure that gets posted, and we'll even set up a section on this one subject.
Okay, that'd be great. And I still owe you information on the Task Force for National and Homeland Security, which I was trying to do this, but Google and that sort of thing, but I haven't come up with it yet. And
well, we'll appreciate it. I hope you have a good vacation down there in the Carolinas, and give our best to Bobby. Thank you so very much for being with us.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Okay, fine. Well, our guest was Ambassador Henry Cooper, and Ambassador Cooper really is very, very concerned about this. Now, he is, of course, with certainly a think tank that is working to try to make sure that we have protection from the very real possibility of a nuclear attack. We need some sort of a nuclear defense here in this country. But an EMP attack is different than a regular nuclear attack. And that is, of course, what they explode. A nuclear device 150 miles up in the stratosphere, and it creates a massive electronic pulse attack that wipes out all the electronics in a large segment of our country. We'll be back in just a moment here at Radio Liberty. Well, this is Dr. Stan, and we do hope you enjoyed the program with Ambassador Cooper. And certainly we've known him for many years. He's certainly on the front lines of so much of what's going on today, and what a privilege to have him with us. And he's going to put me in touch with people who are experts on all of the questions that were brought up today. I don't have the answers, but hopefully as we do a series of programs, we will all learn about this. But I think this is a very real possibility, and this is something that could happen at almost any time. It could happen spontaneously because of solar flares and certainly of the solar magma that we are facing at the present time, or it could happen in response to our foreign policy, or it could be something that could even be done intentionally in an effort to destroy the infrastructure of our society. Because, of course, as Alan Greenspan said, and you can actually see him on the YouTube, the location where he discusses certainly the creative destruction, and you can get this certainly on the internet, typing in certainly at YouTube, Alan Greenspan, Creative Destruction. And he says, we want this new globalist society. The only way to do it is to destroy the old society. Ladies and gentlemen, we're living in the old society. There's an organized effort to destroy that. These things are not imaginary. They're very real. We have people in positions of power who have a different world vision because, in my estimation, they worship a different God. You've got, of course, to go ahead and get my book, Brotherhood of Darkness, my talks on the dark secret and on the forbidden secrets. And, of course, you really can't understand so much of what our leaders say unless, of course, you understand the significance of what's going on today. Our leaders of both political parties are intent upon creating a world government and destroying the infrastructure of our nation. They want to raise living standards in other nations and lower living standards here in America. They want a multicultural, multilingual society, which is why they're bringing in people from Muslim nations, why they're bringing, certainly countless millions of people in from South America, and why they encourage them to continue speaking Spanish rather than learn English and become part of our society. They want a divided society so they can play one group against the other, so they can play black against white and Hispanic against black. And they're doing a very, very good job of it. They know exactly what they're doing. You need my book, Brotherhood of Darkness, my talk on the dark secret, on the forbidden secret, our recent DVD, The Case for a Satanic Conspiracy. The Case for a Satanic Conspiracy. Our DVD certainly on population control, the covert agenda, because there is a covert agenda, and they've already killed billions of people, and they're going to kill billions more. We hope, of course, many of you out there will certainly go to our website at radioliberty.com, where you can pull our programs down, and certainly where you can listen to Radio Liberty 4 hours a day there at our website at radioliberty.com. Our programs are archived there for about 6 weeks. Encourage others to listen. You have our permission to copy into those programs and duplicate them and get them out across America. We have all sorts of DVDs posted there at our website, and you're welcome to watch them, to duplicate them, and pass them out. But let me suggest our newsletters. I mean, some of these newsletters are classic, and they will explain to you what's going on financially, because everything that's taking place today is all contrived. You need, of course, to get my talk. It's on DVD on the financial Armageddon, on the financial tsunami. That's the financial tsunami, the financial Armageddon. You must understand that they're intentionally creating this economic crisis to destroy the infrastructure of our society, because they want to impoverish the American people. Begin protecting yourself and preparing to protect yourself, because we're in for some very, very difficult times. Our telephone number, 1-800-544-8927, 1-800-544-8927. Our webpage, radioliberty.com, radioliberty.com. Please pray for Radio Liberty.
Legion.